Welcome to section 3. We're going to talk about configuration for Xdebug 3. We're not talking about Xdebug 2. Xdebug 2 was great, but there was a lot of configuration options, and they were a little bit obtuse to understand to figure it out. So cool thing is that Xdebug 3 has straightened a lot of this out, and it's much easier to figure out and understand. So let's dive in and let's talk about the first and most important option in Xdebug 3, which is the mode, Xdebug mode. There's a number of options with this. I'm going to talk about the top 3 that I use. Number 1 is Xdebug mode is none, means Xdebug is off. When Xdebug is on, you're pretty much always going to see some level of performance hit. Maybe a little bit, maybe a lot of it, but you're always going to see a performance hit. Your application's response times will slow down. So by disabling Xdebug, your response times will not slow down. They are going to be just as fast because Xdebug is disabled. So Xdebug mode is none. That is how I actually run my applications as much as possible when I'm not needing to use the debugger. Now, Xdebug mode of debug means the debugger can be triggered at any point with an exception. We're going to talk about exception in the next configuration conversations. That's just a couple seconds away. So Xdebug mode of debug means that, the debugger can be triggered at any point. Xdebug mode is of profiler means that the profiler is currently enabled. Now, what is the profiler here real quick? And we're not going to talk about that too much in this course, but the profiler allows you to get the results of the amount of time it takes for every method to run. Which method calls what methods, how many times is it called, how much memory is used, etc., etc. It's really, really powerful. So Xdebug mode of profiler has that on. So you technically might understand you can have profiler and debugger on the same time. Probably not a good idea because it's two very separate ideas as far as what's actually happening. You're not going to want to have your debugger break and while your profiler is running too. It's going to throw some weird numbers into the profiler. So Xdebug mode of none, debug, or profiler are the 3 that you are going to probably use on a very regular basis. Now, the next one though this is where we get into a gotcha. Xdebug mode start with request. We have 3 options on this one for debug mode. Trigger, yes, and no. Trigger, yes, and no. Start with request means, is the debugger available to begin using on a given request? The default value is trigger, and trigger is usable, or happens, I guess, if the Xdebug session value is found in the cookies, get request, or the post request variable. If you're using the Xdebug helper module or extension for Chrome, Firefox, or Safari, it will put this into the cookies value that is being sent back up to the web server. So if Xdebug session is found, trigger is yes. Now, if you have Xdebug mode set to debug and start with request set to trigger, we get into a little bit of a situation, and that is for your CLI commands. Your CLI commands, personally, when I'm running CLI commands, I do not like having to specify the Xdebug session environment variable. I do not like having to specify that. So you can set at the beginning of your session, you can drop it into your Zish or Bash startup profile. You can do that, but what I personally do and what I have in the documentation is to you basically use a little scriptlet helper that actually turns Xdebug mode from none to debug, and start with request is always yes. So I turn this on, I turn this off throughout the day, depending on whether I want Xdebug on or off. If I'm refreshing an application, the caches are all off, I'll usually turn it off unless, of course, I need to troubleshoot how caches are loaded up or whatever. And then once I have all the caches initialized, that request took a little while, but it would take exponentially longer, right, to get when in debug mode. Then I refresh the page, or I take this other action again in debug mode, and it allows me to troubleshoot this or whatever. So I pretty much default to use changing the debug mode or the mode to debug or none, but you can use start with request as well. And personally, I also leave start with request always set to yes. Now, this other one that I want to talk about is logging. If you are trying to troubleshoot Xdebug, the logging can be helpful. Okay, there was a broken connection with PHP Storm or whatever. So Xdebug log, I always have this set to a directory that's easily writable and accessible by me. And so I can, if I run into problems, I can easily browse that to that file, check up and see what's going on there. So Xdebug log is the other value that you need to know about configuration. So again, I told you configuration of Xdebug is very easy, and I look forward to diving now into what I consider to be the most fun sections of all, and that is talking about how to use Xdebug, the debugger in specific. So let's dive into that.